Wednesday, the 11th of March. Over a week ago, the United States started bombing Iran. Why did they do this? And how are they going to extricate themselves from this? That's what we're going to talk about in this video.
Like, comment, and subscribe. Sign up for my free newsletter and links to the guests in the description below.
Morning, Joaquin.
Morning. It's good to see you, Rich.
Yes, and you. I'm really looking forward to this because I track your Telegram. I read your Telegram posts every single day, and I've seen the conversation change as you dig in more and more and more and more and more. So let's start with, why did Trump do this? Why did he attack Iran?
Well, I think that the most descriptive truth came out in the first days after the beginning of this conflict, when Marco Rubio spoke to press. And if you listen to what he said, although within a day or two he was pushed to retract or to walk back some of this, or to clarify, if you will, but I think the first things he said were the most accurate, Rich, and that was that Israel started this war and the United States made an assessment that it needed to join in. And this mirrors the words of the former chief of intel of Saudi Arabia, Turki al-Faisal, who in an interview with Amanpour said, this is Netanyahu's war. So it looked at the very beginning just like this, and that Trump had lost control of an emerging situation, so to speak, which is not to say, however, that you don't have multiple contingency plans. And what we're seeing operate now is a contingency based upon one of the bad scenarios, though not certainly the worst scenario. You have, of course, also a very important interview from last November in describing some of the causes of the June 12-day war from former CIA analyst John Kiriakou, who said that Benjamin Netanyahu had threatened Trump that he would nuke Iran if Trump didn't involve himself in this conflict. And so the thing with nuclear blackmail, I think all of your listeners will understand, is that if the mechanism for said blackmail continues to exist, it's like a gift that keeps on giving. And this is a good way to understand some of the mechanisms operating on Trump as this conflict began.
Okay. So you're suggesting that, was it Israel started attacking Iran first? They started these bomb sorties, and then the US came in order to try and get a hold on the situation. Why didn't Trump say, no, there was surely some other way. You do this and there's going to be no funding, no support, nothing. It's over.
Yeah, so nuclear blackmail is nuclear blackmail.
What do you mean?
No funding, no support. Okay, so Israel launches the nuke and we start World War III.
But then Israel's over.
Well, so is most of the world.
Oh, God.
And remember that Israel is operating the Samson option. So if their allies fail to intervene, and if Israel determines that they have to launch a nuclear device because they determine that's an existential threat, their doctrine states that they also nuke Paris, London, Washington. They nuke their allies for not stepping in, right? That is their nuclear doctrine. It is one of the most problematic nuclear doctrines on the face of the earth. This is nuclear blackmail, according to John Kiriakou, who, by the way, served time in US prison for leaking information on the US torture program at Abu Ghraib. So this is someone whose access to information is solid, and there's someone that has acted on the right side of history in recent years. I can't speak to his motivations earlier in life, but certainly has seen the light, so to speak. So this is a multivariate and complex subject.
Okay. And what about other explanations? Maybe Rubio was saying that just as a cover for the fact that Netanyahu is the tail that wags the American dog. Trump is an arch Zionist secretly. That this is an assault on the city of London because of the connections between the IRGC and London,
Yeah,
as
you've
evidenced
mentioned,
by the
sure. Yeah.
UK's reluctance or reticence to not participate.
Well, I would propose something a little different.
Mhm.
I think it's more clear to just say what I think, and people can put together whatever other people think. But I will also speak a little bit to my own work in the Russian media intelligence sphere and projects that I've worked directly under Glaziev and Makarov and Reshetnikov. I have certainly some experience in this arena, Leonid Savin and others. Their integration and work with the IRGC has certainly surpassed that of any other military diplomatic intelligence arena. So I think the things that I have to share should be somewhat privileged over, there's for every, like they say, Rich, opinions are like assholes. Everybody's got one.
Mm.
And I want to say that all opinions are not equal. My assessment stands as this, and I'll share it with you. Things got out of control. Trump had been convinced. Okay, that was the point of view of Prince Turki Al Faisal, former Saudi intelligence chief.
Mm.
You can add to that John Kiriaku's opinion about what that convincing involved. It also could involve threats, not truth, but threats that they would create an Epstein scandal surrounding Trump at the level of the Senate, Congress, just like you saw. Mind you, at the start of this conflict, whose reel was being released to the public? Who was being deposed by Congress? The Clintons.
Yeah.
Over Epstein. So if you want to talk about this conflict and distractions, whose distraction, right? Who is served best by this distraction, so to speak? Well, of course, it's not simply a distraction. In fact, it has its own strategic meaning and aims. And that's what I'd like to discuss. And I appreciate you providing this platform because this is a matter of literally life and death. The main cause of this conflict is complex, but it involved analyzing Trump's strengths, which, as you understand, are the same thing as weaknesses. Strengths and weaknesses are two sides of the same coin. In strategy, one attacks your opponent's strengths. Lindsey Graham was key in consulting Netanyahu on exactly how to attack Trump's strengths. One of Trump's strengths is he commits to the image of being in total control and that everything that happens is his idea. The problem, the flip side of that, is that then you own everything that happens, even if you weren't in control. So that describes the narrative and answer to your question about why Trump didn't just say X, Y, or Z. Now, you and I might imagine that if we were in that position, not knowing everything that the people involved actually know, we would like to imagine that we would have said yada yada yada.
Yeah.
Imagine that I would have said the same as you've proposed. But that also begs the question. Like, we're not in that position, and there's reasons for that. So this is high stakes game, right? This is nuclear brinksmanship. And this involves an assessment of the strategic culture of Israel, of the United States, of Russia, and should a country like Iran come into possess a nuclear device, it would be a question of their strategic culture as well. So in my work for the Russian Strategic Culture Foundation, strategic culture is the study of nuclear doctrine of various countries based upon a complex, multivariate assessment, not only of their approach or their distinctions between questions like strategic versus tactical nuclear weapons, but also the broader questions of what type of government it is, what are their belief systems, how do they approach questions of deterrence. We had been through the whole period of the second half of the 20th century on the basis of MAD, mutually assured destruction. But of course, you're talking about the United States and the Soviet Union, which were both relatively rational regimes. If you're talking about the question of Israel, where you have, according to Israeli critics from within the country, their great concern is that they're becoming Jewish Iran, that they are effectively a theocracy driven by end times and Armageddon fantasies about the use of nuclear weapons and what the role of their chosen people is in this particular spot in history. So this is quite dangerous, and there are many Israeli Jewish voices for peace that are pushing back against this. And I think many people in the world hope that they succeed to save Israel from itself. The attack on Iran is therefore a complex one, and it is one which the United States had been posturing by pulling their forces in the region for many reasons. That would take another hour to describe the reasons involved, but involve primarily posturing and arriving at an agreement. Now, from everything that's come across my desk between February 22nd and February 27th, Iran and the United States had tentatively agreed on a mutually agreeable deconfliction towards a sound nuclear policy, which both countries could agree on. Then suddenly on February 28th, Israel attacks. Marco Rubio confirmed that with that attack, the United States made an assessment that because Iran had previously said that whoever attacks, we're not going to be lured into this good cop versus bad cop game. Whoever attacks, we're going to attack everyone's assets in the region. We're going to attack the US and Israel. So based upon that, Rubio said that quite transparently to the press. And he said, based upon that, the Pentagon's recommendation, note, he's putting distance between the administration and the Pentagon. He says the Pentagon's opinion was we had to join in on the attack since Iran would retaliate against us, even though Israel had launched the attack. So their assessment was we needed to go in on the attack to mitigate the damages that we would have received otherwise had we been hit first, so to speak, by the Iranians. So this does not justify per se why the US had pulled its resources into the region in the first place. But this was Trump's style. That is his strength, and that strength was used as a weakness. So this is his policy of peace through strength. And his intent was not to attack Iran, from what we can tell. And the fact that Rubio was called upon to clarify or revise those statements days later points to the truth content of those initial statements.
Right. Okay. But couldn't Israel use nuclear blackmail anyway to prevent the US from pulling out? You pull out, we'll nuke it, Iran. We got to keep carrying on.
Yes, it's a very interesting question. We're trying to understand exactly where the end game is. As I've written recently for the Strategic Culture Foundation, this is a gift that keeps on giving and one which responsible powers in the world need to address immediately. Witkoff said something very interesting, however, in a recent interview with American Press. He said that Israel was a one-bomb country. And then he clarified, well, it would only take one bomb to eliminate Israel. But this felt to many who are open source analysts like a communication of a sort. In other words, has there been an agreement to reduce Israel's nuclear arsenal to just one bomb? This would greatly reduce and mitigate the upwards risk factors of any type of conflict in the future breaking out, and it greatly reduces Israel's ability to use the type of nuclear blackmail which former CIA analyst John Kiriakou, according to his sources, says was the foundational threat made by Netanyahu to Trump regarding these conflicts.
Right. Okay. Okay. What a mess.
We don't know. We don't know,
Yeah.
but we're trying to put pieces together. Now, with regard to your question about the IRGC, the City of London, well, certainly we can look at the issue of the JCPOA. And the issue of the JCPOA is that you have several different factions within Iran. You have, of course, the principalists, which people talk about being the hardliners or the conservatives, and you have the reformers. But within that rubric, this was kind of a game, so to speak, much like the uniparty in the United States or in the UK. It was a uniparty where the Ayatollah was trying to do basically, if we can say, vibe check on the population and what types of candidates and talking points should they roll out, and what is our approach to foreign policy. So you have, of course, private owners of the means of production and oligarchs within Iran. There's a tendency for people with money and investments to think along those terms. They might not be very patriotic, if you can put it that way. And they were happy and they were looking to invest more heavily in European and American markets. In fact, they had already. Those were the frozen funds. That's what Obama, when they parachuted the billions of dollars back to this faction in Iran, that's what this was about. So JCPOA, however, is not in Iran's sovereign self-interest. It is a different approach than Netanyahu's approach. Netanyahu's approach is to destroy Iran, to make it a failed state, to make it a black hole, to make it a vector of destabilization and insecurity that would spread throughout the region and eliminate for both the Turks and the Arab GCC Gulf states their strategic triangulation. So the Turks and the Arabs don't have to be allies with Iran, but they understand that if Iran is destroyed, that there's nothing stopping Israel or the British or the Americans in the region. So this is the way that the new strategic thinking represented by MBS from the post-2016 period understands the situation. And they have been at odds primarily with the Emiratis, who are closest to the Israelis in their non-strategic thinking. So I think in understanding when Trump gave the statement that there had been candidates for people that would replace Khamenei, but that they had been killed in strikes too, it is possible, in fact, probable, that those were strikes carried out by the Americans to take out that group of leadership, but that group of leadership would have led to the dissolution of Iran. So while the Israelis took out Khamenei, it's possible, even likely, that the Americans took out another layer of leadership, not the son of Khamenei, but another layer of leadership, the same layer of leadership that had received the billions of dollars back from their frozen assets from Obama. So there's clarity that needs to come into this, because what happens is there are many people that are laymen or attempting to do analysis, and they're quite intelligent people, and they do understand some of the mechanisms, but they don't have the information or the high resolution clarity or history on the subject of Iran and its various factors relating to its inter-elite conflict over the decades.
Right, okay. Bloody hell, Joaquin. Bloody hell. What a mess.
Good morning.
Good morning. What a mess.
What a mess.
What a convoluted, complex, intractable mess.
Yes.
All right, so now what? Because in your Telegram group, you've made comments suggesting that Trump has made noises that he wants to extricate himself from this.
Yes. This is a very difficult question. This is what I appreciate about speaking to your audience, is that it's a highly informed audience that takes a particular and high resolution interest in the details, and these are not things that are appropriate for a Fox News watching audience. This is, you see,
or the Guardian,
right, or the Guardian,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
either way, it's the mainstream left or the mainstream so-called right. This is really not appropriate for them, and the things I'm going to say are things that relate more to the truth and not to the optics or the messaging. We have to understand the gravity of the situation, and it doesn't even require verbal communication between the Iranians and the Americans. So you have to look at what are the consequences, what are the effect. You have to ask the question, cui bono? And what you're seeing right now is Trump is in effect using the Iranians to punish the Israelis for starting this conflict.
Yeah, I've had that thought. I've seen it, because it seems like Israeli defenses are ineffective against the barrage of missiles that Iran's sending. And I looked in your Telegram group this morning, and I think there was something about after Trump said something yesterday about putting an end to this, Iran responded by 3 hours of missile barrage
That's
in
right.
Israel. And we're not getting much out of what is happening in Israel because of the censorship. It's illegal to film.
Yes. It's a 5-year sentence.
Yeah, well, that's to be expected in the only democracy in the Middle East.
That's right. That's right. Yes. Just like over there in your country, you've had what, 4,000 people arrested every year for posts on Facebook.
This is fake news, Joaquin. It's 12,000.
Wow. It's 12,000 per year or over the.
I think the last year we have statistics for it is 12,000.
So it's
Highest
3
in the
times as many as I had thought.
highest in the world per head of population for hurty words on social media.
Well, it's I won't comment, but I think you
No,
guys know what you need to do.
yeah, no hurty words allowed, Joaquin. Okay.
But yeah, so with Iran, Rich, it's a very complex situation. But I would just I would implore viewers and thinkers alike to understand the nature of the communication that Putin and Trump just had the other day about this. They
Yeah.
had an over hour-long conversation, and you know that Russia and Iran have a strategic partnership, and the Chinese have also been providing satellite intelligence that has been helping the Iranians to target in Israel. So that has also even allowed coordination between Iran and Hezbollah to target Israel. So the devastation on the ground in Israel right now is not even really known to many Israelis. They only can talk about, or they would only be able to talk about or confirm what they've seen with their own eyes. But if they don't live somewhere else, the media blackout is within Israel as well. It's not just from Israel to the outside world. So Israel has been badly hit, especially over the past few days. So the Iranian strategy was first to eliminate the anti-missile systems that were stationed in U.S. bases across GCC countries and in parts of Iraq and Jordan. Then, so that characterizes the first 4 to 5, 6 days of this. Over the past 4 days, we've seen an increasing and with increasing effectiveness, just like in the 12-day war, Iranian hypersonic and conventional ballistic missiles striking targets directly in Israel. There are strong reasons to believe that large numbers of the Israeli staff, brass, have been wiped out, that Benjamin Netanyahu's brother may have also been killed or badly injured in one of these attacks. There's a number of other key figures whose children and others in the IDF may have also been injured in attacks on Lebanon, including Smotrich and his son. Smotrich's son is believed to be in the hospital right now with shrapnel having penetrated his liver. So this is something which Israel has tried to learn, not the lesson they needed to, but they've learned the media lesson from the 12-day war that they can't have, people with their phones recording all of these strikes on Tel Aviv and Haifa and central Israel. That is not to say that these are not happening. And in fact, the point that we see is that Bibi Netanyahu has been kind of absent. We don't know where he is for the past 5 or 6 days. Perhaps he's in Germany, but he is most probably not in country.
Okay. So Trump is allowing Iran to punish Israel, I suppose, with the point that at some point the Israeli people are, perhaps even the Israeli government, are begging for an end to this. Because Israel is a tiny country, and without the US bases being able to effect any sort of defense, and Iran with this barrage, because something else I think I saw in your Telegram group about
Yes,
some Iranian minister saying, look, we can do this for 10 years.
that's right. Yes.
Israel can't survive that long.
Yes, when the United States uh, decided to pick up from the French in Vietnam in the early 1960s, the conventional view is that these are just impoverished, underdeveloped Vietnamese peasants. There's no way that they could withstand the losses or the might of the American military machine. Well, within 10, 12 years, the world understood quite differently. And this is a similar situation in that respect. And I think that Trump, for his part, can see clearly um, what is at stake and what is not winnable. We don't really pay attention that much to the things that Trump says at the level that they're meant to be understood by the lay person. There are certainly messages and communications embedded in what he is saying. There's a certain logic to things. We have discovered through rigorous analysis over the past 7 or 8 years that oftentimes Israel, when he mentions Iran, that means Israel. So when you're talking about, for example, the punishment or the degree to which Israel can take a pounding, and then at what point the Israeli people rise up against the government to say this is a crazy policy. When we hear that that's being talked about with Iran, we can actually understand that this pertains to Israel. And there's many other such instances as well. So it is something
Okay.
that takes a lot of work and time.
Okay. You can talk me through that, right? Because how do I know that's just not, I don't mean to be rude. That's not my style, right? But fanciful thinking, you reading into what Trump is saying, what you want to hear and what you want him to say. Because
Right.
I think you and I, we both certainly in the past, well, I still do, right? And you have in the past, shared sympathies and empathy for the plight of the Palestinians. And
Yes.
ultimately, I think you and I, we're from the left. You're the American left. I'm from the traditional British left. And I think what we both want is a region where people coexist peacefully.
Yes.
Just want peace, and we don't want children being bombed. Right. So
Yes.
how do I know you're not just reading into this what you're
Pattern
looking for
analysis.
your own
Yes. Good, very good
confirmation
question.
bias?
Yeah, I get your question. Yeah. Pattern analysis. So this is not ad hoc. This is not being introduced today to explain events today. This is a pretty well-established pattern. And I think when you mentioned Palestinian issue, that speaks very clearly to it. So when Trump was pushing for the Gaza peace, which became the 20-point plan, Netanyahu was pushing against it. Trump, in his truth posts, kept warning Hamas and kept warning Iran about what he was going to do if they didn't accept. But in fact, Witkoff and Kushner, in particular, Witkoff had been negotiating with Hamas. Other American negotiators said many positive things about Hamas. These are reasonable people. They're ready to make a deal, et cetera, et cetera. The the spoilers, right? And who Trump's threats were aimed at. And we saw that because of the result. We saw that in the end game, that when Trump was making threats on Hamas, threats which have not materialized to this very date, Hamas still exists in Palestine. It looks very much like they will be a part of, in one form or another, any government that emerges in Gaza. So this is something that you have to appreciate, not just simply while it's happening, but you have to then assess this and compare to the end result. And the end result is that these threats that Trump was making against Iran, against Hamas, were actually threats being made against Netanyahu, actually threats being made against a part of the Israeli establishment. So to be clear, Trump is not anti-Israel, right? This is like Trump works his plan through the plan. This is completely Game of Thrones. This is like the Borgias, okay? So he marries his daughter into a part of their establishment. You see, he is guaranteeing to the Israeli people that there's a better way forward, that there's a path for peace, right? Another thing to keep in mind is that whenever Netanyahu begins these conflicts, contrary to what Team Trump is trying to accomplish, in the midst of all of it, even while on the one hand, verbally, you might hear Trump often express his support for Israel. Then he'll mention, like no one asked, but then he'll mention Netanyahu needs a pardon. Netanyahu's in a corruption trial. Netanyahu's in trouble. We like Netanyahu. We want to save Netanyahu. This is identical to when Trump recently said, as when the Clintons were about to be deposed, which is actually when this conflict began, as the Clintons are being deposed, Trump says, I like Clinton. It's a shame what's happening to Clinton. It's not fair what's happening to Clinton, or whatever. So these are he's speaking in reverse. This is actually the only way to read what's happening. And it would be fanciful to not read the signs and to not interpret what's happening. The problem, why, you have to ask yourself a question. Why does Trump have such quality communications and relationships with XJP in China or with Putin in Russia? Like, why do they take his word? Why do they know that what he says makes sense? Because they have whole teams of people that analyze his communications, that interpret what is really meant by what is being said. And it's not what's meant for mainstream audiences. This is someone that he communicates rather consistently. It's just that if you're listening to what's going on, on the surface level, you're not going to get an accurate read of things.
Right. Okay. Well, that does make sense. I consider Trump a highly intelligent, skilled politician.
Yes.
He really, really is. You don't get where he is. Can you imagine, Joaquin, you're president of the United States, you get elected, and then you got Russiagate and Ukrainegate and the entire media against you, everything, the globalist institutions, the other governments, and then you come back and win again. That's some feat.
Yes. What people don't always appreciate or remember, that throughout this whole process, that you had HSBC, Lloyd's, JP Morgan, Chase, Citibank, were all against Trump. Bloomberg. I mean, the list goes on and on. Bloomberg switched parties from Republican to Democrat just to give $1 billion to defeat Trump. And the list of financial oligarchs that were lined up against Trump is lengthy. Now, this is an inter-elite conflict, and it's not black and white. Trump has been able to divide certain aspects of finance, has been able to divide and manipulate conflicts between tech oligarchs, Sam Altman, et cetera. This is a very complex, like I said, multivariate story. This is not one-dimensional. So this is not a Marxist story of just people versus power. This is more of a Caesarean conflict of optimates versus populares, and how to divide the optimates. Right? You have figures, for example, in the time of Julius Caesar, like Crassus. Crassus was neither an optimate nor a populares, and he was an opportunist. And he would side typically with the optimates, but if the populares, which means populists, if the populares were coming into power, like we saw with Marius before Caesar, you can see that many successful oligarchs can see which way the wind is blowing. And if it's time to jump ship and abandon globalism and then get behind a different way that power is reconfigured, they're going to do that. We saw in the Epstein files that were released by the U.S. Department of Justice that Epstein was having communications with, was it OpenAI?
Palantir?
Was it Palantir? Yes, Palantir. Yes, thank you. Yes. And in that communication, he had convinced them that the future was not globalism, that the future was not going to be globalism at all, that it was that the multipolarity was rising. So there are many different ways that this weaves. Epstein understood which way things were going. It doesn't mean that the establishment is able to compensate for it because of the ties that they have to the existing status quo. They're not free to just break off and change things. So I think when we talk about the forgive the lapsus, but when we talk about the nature of inter-elite conflict and all these different figures, Krasian and otherwise, it's not so simple as black hats versus white hats. You have what are really a bunch of fence sitters and self-interested parties you might call gray hats.
Mm.
And they're going to go with the direction that the wind blows. What Trump worked on in the first administration chiefly was reorganizing power structures. Power is like water and is going to flow in the direction of the channels that are structured around it. So by changing the architecture, it's going to change the behavior of certain elites. It's going to create new winners and new losers. And those who can see that the new paradigm is going to leave them as losers, they're going to push against it. So I don't want to communicate that what has happened with the start of this conflict was optimal for anyone at all, except for
Mm.
perhaps Netanyahu. I'm saying that this got out of control. Not that it was unpredictable that it would get out of control. So what you are seeing is a contingency plan being pursued by Team Trump in response to what has happened. So I can just speak personally.
Sure.
Everything I've told you is objective. Personally, I find Trump's communications to be pretty sickening. I find them to be pretty disgusting. I don't really get into. I think this has cost him politically tremendously, and I don't know how recoverable politically this is. I know that Vance right now is probably, thinking, my chance of being president is pretty slim at this moment. MAGA as a movement involved a lot of support from people that were completely against these forever wars for Israel. And I think, any conflict where the optics of it are so bad for Trump because it really looks like Netanyahu took control.
Yeah.
Certainly, he attempted to create a situation, but this Epstein compromise goes pretty deep. There certainly must be material on people like Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham has been going nuts promoting this war, but then something very interesting happened. You see, after Israel attacked Iran's oil infrastructure, which the Trump administration said to Netanyahu's people, like, that's crossing the line, like, you can't do that, which, by the way, we understand means that the US role has been limited. I mean, that's the definition of limited. That's the definition of limited. For me, like, as a human being, it's far more than ever needed to happen, I think.
Right.
But that's
Right.
from my position, okay? But definitionally, that means that this is not a total war. This is not a regime change war. That's what's actually coming out now from these closed door Senate congressional hearings about this conflict over the past day. We've had several different senators speak to the fact that we're learning that this is not about eliminating Iran's nuclear capacity. This is also not about regime change. So what is this about? Of course, they're speaking rhetorically, and they're trying to angle this to take Trump down. Now, I think many people in the world right now are right to say, well, who cares? I mean, he deserves it. I mean, fuck him. If he's good, if he's, this is an ugly, awful war, and his rhetoric is quite disgusting. But you have to look beneath the surface, and I think that is where we can understand the real strategy at work. And it's not something for the faint of heart. It's something where you have to separate your feelings from your analysis. And you can't get trolled into the things that Trump is saying, on a podium to the press. This is meant for audiences that are not your audience or mine.
Sure.
So it's very complex.
It is. And Joaquin, just on that, because I think how I listen as a human being and how people are listening to this conversation as human beings is by comparing it to what we already know. That's one of the ways, right? We listen to stuff. Do I agree? Don't I agree? How does this fit in with my worldview? Where can I see this? Where can I see this? And, I work as a child in child abuse.
Yes.
And I've worked with adults that just, the things that they've done to children just make my stomach turn. And there's one level where I'm completely revulsed and opposed to what they're doing. And there's another level where I have to remain professional because I might be in the court arena. So everything has to be evidence-based. And I got to be anything that I speculate on, I have to say, articulate it clearly as a speculation. And I think you're speaking about that, about being able to distinguish our own personal feelings and wants and desires versus, okay, what is actually happening? And then all the opinions and assessments and speculations stripped away. And now I can bring them in, but I got to be able to distinguish these are speculations. And there's something you said that I was thinking about anyway, that would kind of make sense that if Israel is doing most of the bombing sorties and attacks on Iran, the US is playing a minimal role, perhaps, in order to make it look like to the Israelis, okay, we're taking part in this as well. And then perhaps bombing like they did in Syria, like Trump did in Syria many
That's right.
years
Yeah,
ago.
we've talked
Bombing
about this
nowhere,
before.
bombing
Yeah,
nowhere, disused
yeah,
airports and stuff, right? Or
right, right. The
do
end of
we?
a runway
Yeah,
somewhere. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Look,
Do we know if
I
that's
can't.
going
I
on?
don't have intel. I don't want to minimize the gravity of this
No,
personally. I don't
absolutely.
have the intel about the extent of U.S. involvement in these attacks on Iran. But I can definitely tell you that just like with the end of the 12-day war, when it was reported that B-2 bombers were used to strike locations, and when you look at the satellite imagery of those strikes, again, Isfahan struck again. What you see looks like a very different category of bomb or munition. This looks like Tomahawk strikes. Again, I'm very doubtful that that B-2 bombers have been used in this conflict over the past week or since February 28th. I don't know that the U.S. role has been minimal,
Mhm.
but it has been by definition limited. By definition, it's limited. How limited it is, well, we know there's a parameter. It's not aimed at regime change. It's not a total war of destruction. It's not aimed at eliminating Iran's nuclear capacity, things that I had said before publicly, and I think even on your platform have been confirmed that the Iranian nuclear program still exists and that it can't be destroyed by bombing it. And that they're saying now that, well, we would have to send in ground forces to secure the nuclear materials that are beneath this. Can you give me just a moment? So when we talk about these attacks, the degree to which the U.S. is involved, I don't think I don't have enough information on the degree to their involvement. Certainly, official statements are not to be trusted. Everything is official information coming from either side should always be taken with a few grains of salt. And it's for example, this talk about escorting ships in the Strait of Hormuz, or this talk about eliminating Iran's mining of in the Strait. These sound like things which are just invented. And one of the things, when you hear Trump talk about how stupid other politicians are, when you think about with the Bush administration and weapons of mass destruction and trotting out Colin Powell to say that Saddam has these mobile labs or holding up a vial. You can talk about the Niger yellow cake and the dodgy dossier. All these things are, require the crime, fraud of manufacturing evidence and politicizing the intelligence process to create for you the pretext that you need. Trump, by developing a cult of because I said so, Trump, because he's developed this believe me, bro, cult around his personality, simply says, I believe that Iran was going to strike first. You see, had he said something like, well, the intelligence told us that Iran was going to strike first, so we had to hit them first. Well, then what intelligence? Then you're getting stuff, then you have political pressure on the CIA to invent that evidence, or you have political pressure on the Pentagon to invent that evidence. And then you have a scandal. Then you have the New York Times writing op-eds saying, Trump lied and, that he pressured the Pentagon to create a report saying that Iran was going to strike. No, he's transcended all of that. He just makes things up, right? He just invents things from whole cloth. So in the same way that he could end this war and just say, we've succeeded. We did all the things, and his, the mainstream Trump supporters will be like, yeah, we won, and that's it, right? So he could do that right now. He could do that anytime. So because there was no purpose to this. This is not Trump's war, but he has to own it because that's his leadership style. There are strengths and weaknesses in that. There's a trade-off. And I think people like yourself and I would be like, why? We would just tell the truth, right? But we're peasants. We're probably peasants because we tell the truth all the time,
Yeah, that's right. And we're not in that milieu with all sorts of pressures and different agencies and
Right. These people are Machiavellian, they have a complicated relationship with truth. It doesn't mean that they're operating towards war. These are distinct. Trump deceives the public. If you lie to me, I consider that you're doing some injury, like you're trying to defraud me, right? Trump is not lying to the public, right? He's deceiving the world, but he's not lying. He's not operating against the interests of peace. I think that's a distinction to make. And it's hard for me to say this because I'm not like Trump is not on my list of favorite people right now because of the things that he says, because I'm a human being and I react emotionally to his bellicose and ugly war hawk statements, arrogantly bragging about, there was this Iranian naval ship that was doing training exercises in India that was totally unarmed. And as soon as they went into international waters, the Americans sunk them. And he's bragging about it. He was asked, how come you guys didn't just capture the ship because it was unarmed? And he said, because it's more fun to sink it. Now, these are human beings. I know they're soldiers, they're Marines, they're sailors, but they're human beings. And this is by definition a war crime. And these are things that Trump is doing, right? So I have to separate my objective analysis, OSINT, objectively from how those statements, this is not the world. I didn't make this world, man. You know what I mean? Like I was born into it, right?
yeah.
And I'm trying to understand it, and it's my job to do that. So it's I separate those feelings from a raw analysis of the real power dynamics, and in what I'm finding in looking at what is happening and what is most probable, like what is most likely to be true, is number one, to review that Netanyahu sabotaged the peace talks that were all but completely tentatively agreed to by both sides on or about February 22nd through 27th. And on the 28th, he attacks unilaterally. And this doesn't even require consultation with the Americans because you have eyes and ears everywhere. You can see the Israelis are launching their planes. Like you can see this. It's at that moment that the American side decided to join in on that attack to contain and control what is happening. And like I said, there may have been some elements of the IRGC connected to the JCPOA line of thinking within the Iranian establishment, which was to integrate Iran into the City of London financial structures, right? This was actually a psyop devised by Khamenei and the leadership to buy time and to out elements of the Iranian establishment and oligarchy that did want to pull Iran into the sphere of the City of London. Now, that is a different approach than destroying Iran, to be clear. So Netanyahu's problem with Obama's plan was not that it would, it has nothing to, this is not about Iran existing or not existing then for Obama. This is about this is a different approach than Netanyahu's approach. This is about disconnecting Iran from the Russia-China sphere and pulling it irretractably into the Western sphere. Then you can just allow the natural laws of gravity and greed of the Iranian oligarchy who are overly or purely invested into Western markets to do all the work for you from the inside.
Mm.
So, but that would not destroy Iran, create a failed state, right? It would create disbalance in the world economy and create disbalance in global geopolitics. So in that sense, Obama's strategy was different from Netanyahu's, but it would long-term also undermine the sovereignty of the Iranian state. So their sovereignty, right? I mean, there are countries that are not failed states that have very low sovereignty ranking. You see the distinction. So Iran's struggle or their aims are twofold. It's not simply to survive. The Israelis are against Iran existing, right? But it's also to be sovereign. In other words, Iran's central bank, right, is controlled by its state, right? They don't have privately owned central banking, right? Privately owned central banking in the Western metric ties back to City of London control. So Iran is one of the few countries in the world that is still outside of the Bank of International Settlements. They're not a member, right?
Right.
So people who don't understand that and who are speaking like an opposite, this is like some type of upside down funhouse mirror view. I question if they're taking $7,000 per post or not. So now the GCC states, the Gulf Arab monarchies, they are not pro-Iran, but they are anti-Iran being destroyed, because this is quadrangulation. It's like triangulation, quadrangulation. You've got the Turks, you've got the British with the Israelis and the Americans, like the neocons, and the British, Israel. You've got the Arabs, and you've got the Iranians. So you've got this four square power dynamic, right? And the Arabs, they're not trying to convert to Shiism, right? They're not trying to be dominated by Iran, but they understand that if Iran is destroyed, that this balance between the British, American, Israeli project and the Iranian project, which allows them to survive, right? That balance would be destroyed. If Iran is gone, then you're dealing with the Turks and Giuliani, and then you're dealing with the British, Anglo-American, Israeli power. And this completely allows them to be steamrolled by one or the other. Right. And they want neither. They had the experience with the Ottomans. So they don't see the Iranians as allies so much as the enemy of my enemy is my conditional friend. And that's why I refer back to the interview. It's a super important interview for people to watch that former Saudi intelligence chief Prince Turki Al Faisal did with Christiane Amanpour, where she's trying to promote this divisions within Islam, Sunni versus Shia. Is Saudi Arabia happy to see that Iran could be destroyed? And after Iran is destroyed, will they then have rapprochement with Israel and recognize Israel? And he's like, he's a statesman and a gentleman. It's like watching Omar Sharif. I'm much more crude. But he was like, "Bitch, you're fucking nuts." To paraphrase, but he said it in much more respectful language. But he's like, "I'm surprised that you're surprised," and this is a very important thing for people to watch. It actually explains Saudi strategic thinking, and this is new this is unique. This is unique to MBS. Prior to MBS, the Saudis were all over the place. I would just say this, Rich, there had been a long-standing deficit in GCC's lack of strategic thinking. And they were thinking in terms of the Arab League, which also obviously includes Maghreb countries, which is not really their region, North Africa. Egypt, of course, their region, but, Algeria, Morocco, not so much. They were thinking in terms of the Arab League and the petrodollar, right? These are both things that aren't the most relevant factors today. People learned. What I love about the world is that people learn. Strategic thinking emerged in the GCC in the aftermath of the destruction of Syria. They initially were in on the game of destroying Syria. They were providing fighters to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Then they saw exactly how this was being manipulated, that by creating this black hole, by creating this vacuum of stability to their north, that they were not going to profit from this. And any short-term, financial profit or bribes or market interest or weapon sales or oil was not the same thing as something, a lost art called geopolitics. Geopolitics drives these questions, and there's a difference between a geopolitical train spotter or a geopolitical opinion haver and a geopolitical analyst, right? Like, I wouldn't go to a chiropractor if I needed spinal surgery, right? I wouldn't go to a scalp masseuse if I needed a brain tumor removed, okay? Geopolitical analysts went to school for this. It is a field called international relations. It is a difficult thing to accomplish. It's not just looking at events and being smart and having opinions. So the Arabs have learned this, and they have learned geopolitics. Maybe the one country that is still figuring this out are the Emiratis. The Emiratis, this is very interesting. The Saudis and Emiratis just had a conflict in Yemen. The Saudis were bombing Emirati positions in Yemen just a month or two ago. This is right in the news. You can look at it.
Mhm.
The Iranians are also striking the Emiratis. So there is an unspoken, not quite alliance, but on the verge between the Iranians and the Saudis. Now, they have their differences, but they understand this quadrangulation that I'm describing. Strategic thinking with the Saudis, they have a conflict with the Emiratis. The Emiratis, that the UAE is the probable location from which tomahawks were fired at the girls' school that killed 170 students.
Okay. How do you say that? Why do you say that?
Well, in what sense? How do I say that?
I mean, how do you know it was from the UAE? Was it the Emiratis? Was it the Americans? Was it not the
Right.
Israelis?
Yes, I should say that's not controversial. The geolocation data points to the source, the location being in that area where the United Arab Emirates is geographically. That's not controversial. That's not disputed. The question is, like, who launched it?
Mhm.
And it's the messaging from Trump has been interesting because on one level you might just think, oh, he's ignorant, or he's talking out of his ass, or he's throwing sand and distraction, smoke. But he actually said that numerous countries have tomahawks. He mentioned South Korea, and people think, well, what he's saying, the South Koreans, like, why would he do that? Well, you have to look at the relationship between Ukraine and South Korea. You have to look at the relationship between Ukraine and Israel. You have to look at the relationship between the UAE and Israel. Okay, the IDF and the Emirati army have drilled together. Okay, IDF and Shin Bet officers have had and foreseeably have access to Emirati bases. Then you have the question of dominionists and Christian Zionists within the American chain of command. So the idea that the president of the United States or that the chiefs of the general staff are micromanaging the decisions of every naval officer, every crew, every ship is ridiculous. That's not how things go. But we are seeing right now a corruption scandal resurfacing out of nowhere, coming from pro-Trump media, that Hegseth spent a lot of money on things, millions of dollars on lobsters and pianos and luxury stays and hotels, cars. Why is this happening now? Who's the head of the Department of War? In other words, Trump is looking at, who to blame for things which one person doesn't, have eyes and ears and control over every decision made by every part and piece of the military. So it could have been this tomahawk that hit the girls' school, could have been from an American frigate. It could have been from the Emiratis and their base.
It could have been from an Israeli fighter attack plane and equipped with a Tomahawk. That Tomahawk could have come from Ukraine. It could have come from South Korea, etc. Here's another pattern, right? Trump mentioned it could have been Iran that did it. Well, there's the Iran equals Israel equation once again that we've seen so many times before. So does this mean that's the case? No. But these are questions that we're tracking. The things that we're very clear about are the things that the Saudis have said, are the things that Marco Rubio has said, are the things that we can put the pieces together and say with the highest degree of confidence that the Israelis started this war, the Americans made a strategic decision to join in on that war for the reasons that we've been talking about in this past hour. And the results have been that, yes, it has been difficult for Iran to withstand, but Iran has 94 million people. It's a giant country. It's literally a fortress. The whole country is literally a mountain fortress. That's been a historical base of Persian empires for 3,500 years. So this is an ancient civilization. Israel is the size of New Jersey. You know, it's the size of New Jersey. And as Witkoff said, it's a one-bomb nation, which is a strange thing to say. I mean, I know that he said, meaning that it would take one bomb to wipe them out, meaning that Iran can't even be allowed to have nuclear material to create one bomb. You know, there's questions about to what extent they could have a bomb now or what type of bomb that would be. Historically, you need to enrich to 90% to make a nuclear bomb. They've enriched somewhere north of 60%, but it's possible to have some type of heavier, larger, less elegant nuclear device, not a dirty bomb, certainly more like a nuclear weapon, but that they might have enough material. They could have been enriching in the interim. You know, we don't know, but certainly the commitment from Ali Khamenei, now apparently we are told deceased, was his fatwa going back over 25 years. Actually, it was secretly announced in the middle 90s, and it was publicly announced sometime 24 years ago that they are committed to never produce a nuclear weapon. Well, that might not be Iran's position anymore after this experience. Yeah. And so the consequences of this might be quite opposite from what Netanyahu had hoped to achieve. And the questions we're looking at now, given that Israel has been engaged in this nuclear blackmail, perhaps, I mean, according to John Kiriakou, I have no opinion, but his credibility is rather high. And Kiriakou saying that Netanyahu's been using nuclear blackmail to force Trump's hand. I had thought before being exposed to Kiriakou's opinion that they were going to simulate some type of Epstein thing with Trump and try to, because we know that the neocons in the Senate, plus all the Democrats in the Senate and Congress, could create an impeachment scandal around Epstein because enough people, mostly because of Blue Anon propaganda, Blue Anon, BLUE, because of Blue Anon propaganda, people think that, and because of Bondi's games that she's played with the release, and because of Trump's statements that everything is a hoax, which many parts of it may end up being. Rich, all this is coming out in the age of AI where we can't even really tell what we're seeing is real or not. We don't even know to what extent this conflict is a hyper reality. I mean, we can go very deep. I'm trying to communicate in a way that's at least coherent to people that treats some main component of some type of, this is an epistemic approach to knowledge, that there's some baseline reality that we're going to assume, even though all of this is coming through our 7-inch screens or our 35-inch screens. We're not there in person. And, you know, we have to start from a highly, highly skeptical position that it's possible that none of this is real. You understand?
Yeah. Which,
I mean,
which,
as a starting point. And then you have to introduce, like, okay, well, are people on the ground in Israel who have no real skin in game saying that, Iranian missiles are hitting them? Yes, it looks like that. Okay, are people on the ground in Iran that are just regular people with no skin in game confirming that missiles are hitting them? Yes, it looks like that, right? But we have to start from the position of nothing is real. And then we have to slowly introduce, just like if you're doing a cleanse diet, you know what I mean? You have to slowly introduce the things that, okay, this is probably part of reality. Okay, something's happening. You follow?
Yeah, let me bring something in, which is something that our good friend Tom Luongo has said a couple of times. And right now, you and I are planning to have a three-way recording with Tom sometime next week, because Tom's of a different point of view about this. And it'd be good to have that conversation. I'm going to let people know it's scheduled, but, there's all sorts of hiccups that happen in life, which is why I don't usually announce what I've got coming up. But do subscribe, comment, like, and watch out for that. But Tom said on Friday, when I recorded with him last Friday, is that the war is pretty much over because Israel's announced that the commercial flights have resumed in Tel Aviv. Now, commercial flights have resumed will resume on Sunday in Tel Aviv. And then I looked at, because this information is available online, I looked at Tel Aviv Ben Gurion Airport Departures Board. And on Sunday, there were flights in and out, including flights to other places in the Middle East. And then I looked at Iranian departure boards. And Iran has got many airports. And there are flights in and out of Tehran and Isfahan.
Yes.
So then I checked with retired General Blaine Holt. And he said, when there's missiles flying in and out of a country, airports close, commercial flights close.
Yes, typically.
So this ties into what you were saying earlier. Do we really, really know what's going on?
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure that Tom and I fundamentally disagree. And certainly I wouldn't disagree that it's possible that at this stage in the conflict that there's tremendous degrees of hyperreality going on. But I would also suggest that it was announced last Friday. So this was, we're already well into the middle of next week from last Friday. And last Friday, it was announced that Ben Gurion Airport would be opening on Monday. You have to understand, though, that from the Iranian perspective, it is not strategic to create jeopardy for civilian airport, Ben Gurion Airport. Why? Because it exposes the fact that Israelis want to leave. If, for example, in other words, they've made commitments not to target that airport.
Right.
You see, because they would like Israelis to return back to Europe or America, where they come from. And
that makes sense.
And if they couldn't leave, then Israel could promote the illusion that the reason no one's leaving is because we all believe in staying here and we're going to weather this and all of that. Now, in terms of, I think that this is probably also the result of the communications between Putin and Trump. So, right.
Tell us about that. What do you think happened between those two?
Well, this is an ongoing relationship. And, the Russians are developing 7 more nuclear reactors in Iran. And it would be most reasonable if the American side were to invest in Russian nuclear power, as they already are. I mean, the United States and Western countries rely today, and has not been much affected by sanctions except for a brief period during the Biden regime, that Russia enriches uranium for nuclear reactors used by the West to this very day. So the Americans can invest in a Russian state synergy, public co-private interest, right, who in turn has a subsidiary building these reactors in Iran and enriching uranium. So there may be an outcome where Russia enriches Iran's uranium. There may be an outcome where Iran enriches Iran's uranium, but in a complex which has both American and Russian co-ownership. So there's several different possible outcomes. I don't have a crystal ball, right? But I know that these are projects underway, and it also makes sense that in terms of delimiting the conflict that Trump and Putin communicated about, the extent to which this conflict goes on, continues in Iran, but also within the context of the conflict, the limitations within that conflict. So not just the length or duration, the various off-ramps and ways that it ends. So Trump could have ended this already. You have to start to figure out why this is going on. Who right now is getting hit the most? It's not the US.
Israel.
It's Israel. This is meant to foment economic, political, and intelligence pushback against the Netanyahu regime. So it doesn't mean that Netanyahu will be out. It's many ways, it's better to have someone in there that you can have some control and leverage over. It's possible that Israel is being denuclearized as we speak, or it has just happened, or it will happen. Witkoff's statements were very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. And I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill. There are many different communications and things that may not pan out, that may not turn out in that way. I'm not over-invested in any one of these particulars, but you have to take all the pieces in toto. You have to take all of this together. And there's a lot of smoke, So are smoke generating machines, no doubt. But often when there's smoke, there's fire. So we're trying to figure out exactly what is going on, separate the possibilities and the likelihoods from the things that are least likely, and then look at the things that are pretty sure that this is the case so far. So, yeah.
Looking at the balance of probabilities, like that's what I do as a social worker. I investigate. I've never seen child abuse happen. Never seen it happen.
Right.
I see the red flags, and I have all the information. What I do, I have to pass it all, just like you do so skillfully in the geopolitical arena, which is why people really, 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 really should go and follow you on Telegram, which is t.me/Joaquin X with an XOAQUIN.
No, it's even easier. It's just at New Resistance.
Oh, yes.
Yes, it's the t.me. I mean, if you want to, it's like we don't want to give the www version of things. It's just on Telegram in the search window. It's the @ symbol at New Resistance. That's how you will find me there. I have been, banned from most all other platforms over the years. Understandably, uniquely, I've worked alongside key figures in Russia's establishment. My bona fides are there for the world to see. I was involved in the Katahan project, which was directed by Klimov and Glaziev and others, Reshetnikov. I'm humble, I'm aware of the things I don't know. So I'm never in the position of wanting to overstate, but I'm also not my own best PR rep either. I would say I have a fair amount of knowledge about the process underway and the strategic thinking involved.
Yes, absolutely. Really great at passing out the information and everything. And adding to the mix, there's what you say to me, there's what Tom Luongo, Alex Craner, and Blaine Hall, and Harley Schlager. I listen to them all. I listen and learn, which is why I recommend go check out Joaquin's Telegram channel and consider joining his Patreon group. You can find out more in the Telegram group. And I look forward to, thank you so much for watching. Tell us what you think about Joaquin's analysis. And I look forward to speaking to you again next week. Joaquin, hopefully joined by our friend Tom Luongo. This is Rich and Joaquin signing out. All the best. Bye-bye.